Today, let's discuss inferior goods and Giffen goods. An inferior good is a type of good whose demand declines when the income of the consumer rises. We know for a fact that the quantity demanded of a normal good rises as the income of the consumer rises. But the demand of inferior goods is inversely related to the income of the consumer. That is, as the income of the consumer rises, the demand for the inferior good consumed falls. For example, suppose there are two commodities that the consumer consumes, strawberries and potatoes, and assume that the consumer consumes both. Here, strawberries is considered a normal good and potatoes is considered an inferior good. Suppose the income of the consumer rises, then he would be more inclined towards buying strawberries, which are costlier than potatoes. Have a look at the figure A, where the demand curve DD of strawberries is shifting towards the right, that is, towards demand curve D dash D dash, as a result of an increase in income of the consumer. At the same time, the figure B represents the demand curve for an inferior good potato, where its demand curve shifts towards the left from DD to D dash D dash. As you can see, the demand for an inferior good doesn't satisfy the law of demand. Now, let's move on to Giffen goods. Normally, when the price of a good rises, people buy less of it. This typical behavior is called the law of demand. And we know that the demand curve is downward sloping. However, sometimes demand curves can slope upward. In other words, consumers can sometimes violate the law of demand and buy more of a good when the price rises. I'll explain this in detail. Let's consider an example where the consumer consumes two goods, meat and potatoes. Suppose the consumer is at budget line BA, where his optimum point of consumption is at C. As you can see, the consumer is at indifference curve I1. Now, assume that the price of potatoes has risen, and as you can see, the budget line rotates inward, and the new budget line is DA, where the optimum point of consumption is at E. We can see that he moves to indifference curve I2 here. Now, let's see how the quantity consumed of meat and potatoes have changed as the price of potatoes increased. We can see that the quantity consumed of potatoes has increased from OK to OF as the price of potatoes increased. So, why is the consumer responding in this strange way? Note that potato is an inferior good. That is, potatoes are a good that a person buys less when her income rises and more when her income falls. We have already learned that a change in price have two effects, income effect and substitution effect. The increase in the price of potatoes makes the consumer poorer. That is, the higher price puts her on a lower indifference curve. This is because the purchasing power of the consumer has declined due to a rise in the price of potatoes. We have learned that inferior goods doesn't satisfy the law of demand. That is, as the income of the consumer falls, the demand for the inferior good rises. So, in this case, the real income of the consumer falls as the price of potatoes increased. The income effect will act in such a way that the consumer will want to buy more potatoes as its price increased and less meat to compensate for the increase in money spent on potatoes. At the same time, because the potatoes have become more expensive relative to meat, the substitution effect makes the consumer want to buy more meat and fewer potatoes. If the income effect is much larger than the substitution effect, as it is in this example, the consumer responds to the higher price of potatoes by buying less meat and more potatoes. In this example, potatoes are a giffen good. Giffen goods are inferior goods for which the income effect dominates the substitution effect. Therefore, they have demand curves that slope upward. So, Giffen good is a good for which an increase in the price raises the quantity demanded. Economists use the term Giffen good to describe a good that violates the law of demand. The term is named for economist Robert Giffen, who first noted the case of Giffen goods. Therefore, Giffen goods are inferior goods for which the income effect dominates the substitution effect. Note that all inferior goods are Giffen goods, but all Giffen goods are not inferior goods. This is because Giffen goods are those inferior goods where the income effect dominates the substitution effect. I hope this concept is clear. Thank you.